I'm Dr. Cynthia Tate, and I am with the Build Initiative. Part of my work with the Build Initiative is to bring an awareness to the early childhood community about what's going on in the child welfare system, and to hopefully be able to bridge a gap between those who care about our youngest children and those who care about our children who find themselves in the child welfare system. And so, as a part of that work, I'd like to always give a little bit of background, talking to predominantly the early childhood community about why you should really care about the children that are in foster care. Why is it your business? And so I want to tell you this. There is approximately 40% of the victims of child maltreatment are between the ages of 0 and 4. Infants and toddlers are removed from their homes at a rate more than double the rate of 4 to 17-year-olds. And in 2019, more than 30,000 infants under the age of 1 were in foster care, and more than 145,000 between the ages of 1 and 5. Children of color are disproportionately represented, particularly Black children and Indigenous children. So we know how important the first 5 years of a child's life are, and we know that those years are important to the development of their brains, and the development of their brains guides everything else: their ability to learn, their ability to make relationships, their long-term abilities to earn income and be independent. It's related to their health. It's related to everything. And so when you think about disruptions that occur with children who are very young, we know that there are lifetime implications. And so that is why I'm so excited for this conversation, and I have been excited for a while. And I want to introduce you to Professor Dorothy Roberts. It's really my privilege to be here to be able to have this conversation with Professor Roberts. She is the George A. Weiss University Professor of Law and Sociology at the University of Pennsylvania, and the director of the Penn Program on Race, Science, and Society. She is internationally recognized as a legal scholar and a sociologist. She has written and lectured extensively on the interplay of race, gender, and class inequities in U.S. institutions. She's been a leader in transforming thinking in reproductive justice, child welfare, and bioethics. Her latest book, Torn Apart, exposes the foundational racism in the child welfare system and calls for radical change. I can't think of anyone else who more eloquently describes the ways in which our systems are failing children and families. So she has given me permission to call her Dorothy. So Dorothy, welcome. And thank you so much for having this conversation with me.
Oh, thank you. Thank you, Dr. Tate, Cynthia. I really appreciate the invitation to have this conversation with you.
Oh, great. I want to just say, what the goals are for our conversation today. I want to make sure that people understand the racial disproportionalities in the child welfare systems. That's very important. So we want to talk about that. We want to make sure that people, again, understand why it's important to care about young children in the child welfare system. And we want to know what the foundations are policy-wise. What's the policy history that got us to the point where we are, where the child welfare system is, I'll just say, functioning as it is, and you'll tell us how it's functioning.
Yeah,
Okay.
yeah.
And I want to talk about this idea of abolition. And I want you to talk about the idea of abolition. I'm going to just ask you some questions about that, as that is a movement, and it is a growing movement, and it is a movement that some people find frightening. And so we want to be able to broaden the tent of people who consider themselves a part of this.
Yeah.
And so we want to talk about that a little bit.
My pleasure.
Sounds good? Okay.
Happy to dig in.
Okay, great. So you've done all this work, all this research for a long time. This is not your first book.
No.
Torn Apart is, I don't know, what number book is it for you?
Well, it's my fourth book, but it's my second book on the child welfare system. So in 2001, I published a book called Shattered Bonds, The Color of Child Welfare. And Torn Apart is really looking at 20 years of work against racism in the child welfare system. 20 years later, I decided to write a new book.
Yes. And so before
Shattered
Bonds,
Bonds. Mm-hmm.
how did you get to that? What led, I'm just trying to find out what led you to this
Sure.
work in general. What were you
Sure.
seeing, or what led you to it?
Well, prior to Shattered Bonds, I published a book called Killing the Black Body, Race, Reproduction, and the Meaning of Liberty in 1997. And I began research on that in the late 1980s. And what drew me to that were the prosecutions of Black mothers for being pregnant and using drugs. Uh, in the late 1980s, there was a so-called war on the epidemic of crack cocaine, which was mostly targeted at Black communities. There was this myth of the crack baby who was supposed to grow up to be really a monster, have irreparable harms to its body and mind. All of this has been disproven. But this was a very popular myth circulating, and many states took a very punitive prosecutorial approach to that and began to prosecute Black mothers who were pregnant and using crack cocaine. And I was very alarmed by this. I thought this was a bad policy based on myths and bad science and just made up stereotypes about Black mothers. And so I began to investigate that and speak out against these prosecutions. But I soon learned that even more than the numbers of prosecutions were the removals of newborns from their mothers by the thousands, by the tens of thousands in big cities around the country. And there was even a name for these babies. They were called border babies because there was really nowhere to put them. They were being boarded in hospitals. And their children were suffering not because so much of their mother's behavior, but having been taken from their mothers and kept in these really harmful environments for them. And so that's what drew me to find out about the child welfare system. I was teaching at Northwestern University at the time and in the city of Chicago, where I discovered that almost all the children in foster care were Black children. And as I began to observe court proceedings, I'm a law professor, and that I was drawn to the court proceedings in the dependency courts there. I saw literally only Black mothers and children before judges, mothers pleading to get their children back. And I began to meet mothers in Chicago whose children had been taken from them. And they told me terms like, my children were kidnapped from me. This is modern day slavery. And I found out that mothers were having their children taken from them, including newborns, for these really baseless allegations, in the sense that the way to address it was not taking babies away. It should have been drug treatment or social services, or actually being able to raise your child in a healthy, sustainable environment. Because the main harms to these babies, and this has been shown by subsequent research, was poverty.
Yes.
Not their mother's drug use. And so that's what should have been addressed. And I was so shocked when I discovered that at the time, in the late 1990s, Black children were 4 times as likely to be taken from their families as white children. And Black children made up the largest group of children in foster care. The largest group. Now, Black children are a minority of children in the United States, but they were the largest group. They were 40% of children in foster care at the time. And I was just astounded. Why isn't this a major civil rights issue?
Why isn't somebody talking about this?
Why isn't somebody talking? This is obviously, there has to be racism behind this. It cannot be that this is a system that's really protecting and improving children's welfare, and it's so disproportionately Black children. What institution in America, right, it treats Black children better than white children? And as I started looking into the history, looking into the statistics, I began to see that this was a form of longstanding oppression
Yes.
against Black families.
So tell us about that. Tell us
Yeah.
about, excuse me, tell us about, take us from enslavement through the apprenticeship system, because that
Yes.
helped explain a lot to me.
Absolutely. Yeah.
And sort of take us through the policy trail,
Yes.
basically, that got us to what you're describing now.
Yes. Such an important question, because many people will say, well, maybe, and there are social work scholars who say, well, maybe Black children need this protection more. And my response is, no, this is a policy choice to treat the problems and needs of Black children in a particularly harsh way. And we can see this by looking at the history, the foundations of the very ideologies behind the child welfare system, what I call a family policing system, because that's
Yes.
really what it does. If we look back to the institution of slavery. So during the slavery era, family separation was key to the power of white enslavers over Black families. It was routine. Black parents had no legal authority at all over their children. They had no legal rights to live with their children even, or to raise their children. The white plantation owner was considered the head of the entire plantation family, his own children, but also the children of enslaved Black people. And Black families were torn apart for any reason, mainly economic reasons. At the auction block, if there was one purchaser who wanted to purchase the mother separate from the father, they would do it. If they wanted the children bought out separately, that could happen. It was all up to the white enslaver's decision. And so judges would order these breakups of families right there on the auction block. But even after children were born on a plantation or farm, it was up to the white enslaver to decide whether they would stay together or not. And most of the time, it was in the economic interest to keep them together. But if it wasn't, if the enslaver wanted to sell off a mother, a father, a child to earn the money from that, it was up to him to do it, to punish families. And this happened all the time. Your father or mother, you're not being obedient, I'm going to sell your children away. On the other hand, it was also a threat to Black mothers. If you don't be obedient, I'll sell your children away, to keep them from running away.
Yes.
And so we find that it was very unlikely that Black mothers would flee plantations. And if they did, they would try to bring their children with them. But of course, that made it more difficult. So family separation, an inherent part of the slavery system. But that didn't end with the abolition of slavery or with the passage of the 13th and 14th Amendments, which, by the way, were amendments that addressed this breakup of families. This was one of the main horrors of slavery that anti-slavery abolitionists pointed out. The breakup of families was seen as one of the main sins of the slavery system. And I think this is important to remember, that there have been abolitionists from the very beginning who fought against family separation. But we'll get to that a little bit more later.
But that's a good point.
Yes.
Important.
But after abolition, of course, we know that in the South, white supremacists wanted to take back power. There are many who still want to take back power today. And they set up legal apparatus to get power back by disenfranchising Black people, trying to deny them, and they did deny them, their right to vote. This was part of the Jim Crow system. Another part that many people are aware of is passing criminal laws and enacting a convict leasing system where Black people routinely picked up off the street, charged with petty offenses, sometimes just being on the street without sufficient excuse, and put into prison on chain gangs for forced labor, but also leased out to companies, coal mines and railroads and factories to work, forced work for these manufacturers and CEOs of businesses. And this is how the South was rebuilt
Yeah.
through the forced labor of Black people. So a continuation of slavery.
And
Now,
that's what they call the apprenticeship.
well, so
Or
here
is that
I'm going to
next?
get to.
That's next.
I'm relating this to the apprenticeship
Okay.
system.
All right.
So,
Great.
and my point is, people. I think many Americans more and more know about this process in the South to basically re-enslave Black people.
Mhm.
But what fewer know about is the apprenticeship system. So, white enslavers also wanted to get back the labor of Black children, put them back under their control. And they did that through the apprenticeship system. So child apprentices already existed. This was a system of putting children, impoverished children, mostly impoverished white children during the slavery era, into work for families, but then also it was supposed to train them in reading and writing and arithmetic and that sort of thing. Well, the way that white enslavers took back the labor of Black children was to petition courts alleging that Black parents were neglectful, and then judges would agree with them and order these children to be put into the care of former white enslavers, sometimes put right back into basic slavery for the same people who were enslaving them. This is a form of forced labor by Black children for white families. And I think that this really is the bridge between the slavery era and the modern child welfare system for Black families. I call it the origin of the court-ordered foster care system for
Mhm.
Black families, because it mimics so much the way in which or I should say, the child welfare system today mimics so much the way in which this apprenticeship system worked. You know, court petitions alleging neglectful parents, judges ordering those children removed from their parents and forcibly put into other people's homes who would supervise them.
Yeah.
And Black people did protest against it. There were even court cases. In Torn Apart, I talk about a case called In re Turner, where a Black mother in Maryland petitioned the court, happened to have a judge, Judge Chase, who was on the U.S. Supreme Court, who was visiting this court in Maryland. And she brought a claim that this violated equal protection because white children were given lessons when they were apprentices, but Black children were just being forced to work
Yeah.
for these people who were supposed to be supervising them, who had now had custody of the children.
Can we talk about a little bit more about family separation?
Mm-hmm.
I have a bunch of questions, but
Mm-hmm.
I'd like you to talk a little bit about family separation in the context of Indigenous children,
Oh, yes.
right? So
Sure.
go
Another
for that.
important
They've got
part.
like 4 to 5 times as many Indigenous children in child welfare
Yes,
as white children.
yes.
Just
Yes, I think
expound on that.
it's not an accident that the two groups that are most likely to be separated, to have their families separated, are Black and Indigenous families.
Yeah.
Today in the United States at far higher rates, and to have one of and have both parents' rights terminated as well. So at this very same time that this child apprenticeship system was being used to return Black children to virtual slavery in the South, there were so-called Indian wars going on in the United States, with the U.S. government trying to dispossess Native tribes of their land. I think people are familiar with this history.
Yeah.
But what they may be less familiar with is that child removal was used as a military strategy to defeat Native tribes. this was a weapon, literal weapon of war. This is not a metaphor, a literal weapon of war that was invented by the U.S. military to attack Native tribes. And so military soldiers would go in and steal Native children. And initially, some of them were put in military camps. There was the Carlisle Industrial School in Pennsylvania was one of the first so-called boarding schools for Native children. And there was a whole network of hundreds of schools, so-called boarding schools, this euphemism. They were actually uh, abusive institutions where Native children were stripped of their culture. Their hair, their hair was cut. They were put into Western style clothing. They were sexually and physically abused. Many died and were put in mass graves which are just now being discovered in Canada as well as in the United States, though. And also sent out to work for families for hire, and just treated in abysmal ways, stolen from their family and from their culture. And this went on for decades because after this formal military strategy was ended, it morphed into what was called the adoption policy for Native children. And this was a policy of the U.S. federal government with the Child Welfare League of America, a formal policy to find Native families neglectful and by social workers. This is part of the formal child welfare system, and remove them and put them in white-dominated orphanages and white families to be adopted. And so this was such a devastating policy that eventually Congress passed in the 1970s the Indian Child Welfare Act to put a stop, ICWA, to put a stop to this policy, although ICWA has not been successful in reducing substantially the numbers of Native children who are removed. And as we just said, they continue to be removed from their homes, put in foster care, and their parents' rights terminated at far higher rates than white children.
So family separation is a longstanding policy of the United States.
That's absolutely right.
And so when family separation started happening on television in front of our faces,
right,
in the last administration,
yes,
and we saw horrible pictures of children being ripped from their mothers and crying and everything, and the whole trauma-informed community came up and said, you cannot do this. It's going to affect these children forever. And so we're also sitting back and we're knowing that this has happened to Black children, this has happened to Indigenous children, because family separation is the policy of the United States.
Absolutely.
So let me ask you this question. So what is the thinking, what is the belief system that underlies this kind of federal, national, historic policy?
So of course, the people who support family separation are never going to say we're doing it to harm children. They're always going to say we're doing it to protect these children, despite all the evidence of harms to children. And I love that you brought up the example of the family separations at the border, because when that happened, I think a majority of Americans saw that it was traumatic. And in fact, as you said, the experts came out with briefs and statements and studies all showing the terrible, long-lasting harm to children of being forcibly taken from their parents. So what is this explanation, of this disconnect that we know it's traumatic to children to take them from their families, but on the other hand, we have official policy that relies on family separation. This is why I call it a family policing system, because it relies on the threat of or actually taking children away. That's the main service given to Black children in America by the child welfare system, is family separation to this day. That's what most of the federal money is spent on. Okay, so what is behind this? And I'm so glad you asked about ideology, because you've got to get to the thinking behind it. You've got to get to the thinking behind it. So The ideology behind it, and I'll mention three things. Okay, one is the idea that if a child is being harmed at home, it must be the fault of the parent. So there's an ideology of blaming parents
Mhm.
for harms to children. Now, we know that most of the harms to children that bring them into foster care are what's called neglect. It's a failure to meet children's needs. The main reason why parents fail to meet their children's needs is because they can't afford to do it, or they may have some problem that makes it difficult to do it. But it's not because they deliberately want to deprive their children of clothing, of
Right.
food, of housing. Most of the reason why they're families that are houseless is because of poverty and very stingy and harmful housing policies that we have in the United States. So, poverty, we know in the United States, we have the highest child poverty rate of any nation, Western nation.
Yes, we do.
We're a wealthy nation, but we have a horrific child poverty rate. It's not the fault of parents. There's structural reasons for this. But the ideology that fuels the family policing system is it's the fault of parents. Now, added to that are racist stereotypes about Black families, and they come straight from that history I mentioned during the slavery era. The idea that Black parents don't really care about their children. This was promoted to justify separating families. And it's a basic, long-lasting stereotype about Black people that we don't really have loving bonds with
Yes.
with our families. And so it's easier, and this has been proven in studies, that caseworkers find it easier to remove Black children than white children for the exact same harms and risks to children. So there's that stereotype, especially, and this came up in my research for my first book, Killing the Black Body, about the prosecutions, a devaluation of Black women's childbearing and mothering, that we not only don't care, we're neglectful, that we spend money on ourselves. The icon of the
Oh,
welfare queen
yes.
who
Hmm.
had babies just to get a welfare check, but she didn't really care about her children. These are powerful stereotypes that have fueled policies in the United States for a long time.
Hmm.
And so we add to this thinking it's parents' fault when children are harmed, and Black parents in particular are especially neglectful of their children. And then there's another ideology, which is, all right, instead of changing our society, instead of having more equal and humane housing policies, instead of really addressing child poverty, instead of really dealing with substance abuse, with voluntary, high quality, available treatment for everybody.
Hmm.
Instead of making sure that all children have good nutrition, we don't do any of that in the United States. Instead of doing that, we will blame parents and ignore the need for social change. And this props up a system that is market-based, that says you've got to go it on your own. And if you fail, it's your fault and we're going to punish you for it.
That's right.
And
That's right.
so those are the ideologies that underlie the child welfare system today.
And that set of ideologies giving rise to the history, the policy history,
Hmm.
then serves as the foundation for family policing.
Absolutely.
So tell us what family
Absolutely.
policing is and how it
Yeah.
works.
Yeah.
And then we're going to talk a little bit about mandated reporting.
Okay. Well,
So,
that's a big part of family policing.
right, exactly.
I'll hold off on
Okay,
that because it
okay.
follows.
Yes, yes.
So I call the child welfare system in the United States, including foster care and uh, child protective services, CPS, all of these pieces of it, family policing, because I think that better captures what the system does.
Yeah.
It's not really a system that aims to protect children, that aims to improve children's welfare, to care for children. if that were the case, we would have a very different system of supports for families, like, the one I described that
That's
we
right.
do not have in the United
Nope.
States. Instead, what it does is it accuses parents of child maltreatment, and then it investigates the families, and then it prosecutes them for child maltreatment, and again, mostly neglect. And then it
Mhm.
threatens to take children away. And if you don't comply with a mandated set of tasks, your children will be taken away, and they'll be kept in so-called foster care until you comply. And if you don't comply, in fact, if you don't comply with every single mandate, you are at risk of having your parental rights terminated and a legal disruption, permanent disruption of your relationship with your children. And then your children are not placed in a caring environment. They're placed in a system that is very institutionalized, in many places privatized. And so the incentives are not for care, they're for just housing children who are often moved multiple times from placement to placement. Many are put in congregate care, including residential treatment facilities where children have been killed by staff, and many reports of harms to children in these situations. Not to mention what we talked about before, the trauma of being
Yes.
separated from their families, their siblings, their friends, their schooling. This is very disruptive. So all of that put together is a description of policing families. It's a form of regulating, supervising, and punishing families instead of truly caring for and supporting them
Yes.
and children.
I was really interested. Let me say for the record, I
Mm-hmm,
spent 7 years at the
mm-hmm,
Illinois Department of Children and Family
mm-hmm,
Services
mm-hmm,
before I went into early childhood.
mm-hmm.
I saw a lot of what you're talking about.
Yeah,
And I had a lot of experiences of feeling like we're solving the wrong problem.
yeah.
So,
Right, right.
we're solving the wrong problem. Something's not right here,
Yeah,
because we kept solving the same problem over and over and over again. It was
yeah,
never really solved.
right.
So, so I saw a lot of this that you're talking about, but in
Mm-hmm,
your book,
mm-hmm.
you talked about the effects of family policing on an entire community. You talked about
Yes,
Woodlawn,
yes,
very well known to me.
yeah, yeah,
Can you say a little bit about how what that did
sure.
to undermine the relationship between
Yes.
family members and community members? And let me stop talking.
Right,
Tell me
right.
tell about that.
Well, while I was doing my research on the family policing system, in fact, after I wrote my first book, Shattered Bonds, and became very familiar, as I mentioned, I was living in Chicago at the
Yes,
time.
yeah,
I taught at Northwestern for
yeah,
14 years, and I began to think that most of the research, even looking at racial disparities in who gets involved in the system, didn't really capture the real harm to communities because it's looking at individual cases, adding up the numbers, comparing the number of cases of children investigated or children in foster care who are Black versus those that are white, but it's an accumulation of individual statistics. But that doesn't tell you what is the impact on a whole community where the whole community is affected by the child welfare system because there's so many families in the community that are involved in this system. So if you look at, and I had seen a map of Chicago where they had shown in red the Black neighborhoods. And Chicago is a very segregated city. So
very.
there are a number of predominantly Black and impoverished neighborhoods in Chicago, including Woodlawn.
Mm-hmm.
And then overlaid over that, someone put a map of poverty. And most of it was concentrated in those Black neighborhoods. And then they overlaid a map of where DCFS cases were. Lo and
I've seen those
behold, have you
maps.
seen that?
I have.
Exactly the same. So the cases where most of the DCF involvement were the same neighborhoods that were impoverished and segregated Black populations. And so I thought, okay, that means more than just looking at the numbers of children in foster care. Everybody in that neighborhood, whether you've had a child in foster care, you've been in foster care, you know about foster care because for sure you have a relative,
That's right.
you have a neighbor, you have a classmate, you have a friend who has been involved in the family policing system, in fact, who's been put in foster care. And so I wanted to look at what is the impact of that. And I could not find any research looking at that. And so I said, okay, I'm going to conduct my own little study. And I went into Woodlawn. I fortunately found a daycare center in a housing project where the director wanted to help me with my research. And so I set up a little office, a little desk, and I began to recruit mothers and grandmothers and aunties who were coming to pick up their children from from this daycare center and interviewed them. I had 25 in all. And the first question I asked them was, "Are you aware of DCFS?" Well, every one of them. Of
Yes.
course.
Of course.
Of
Who's
course
not?
I am. Who's
Yes.
not?
Yeah.
You know, how many people in Woodlawn are involved in it? Oh, people say, oh my goodness, 90%. You know, look at that block over there. Everybody
Has
is
at least been
involved.
investigated.
At least investigated. And by the way, let's not pass over the statistic that recently came out that half of Black children in America will be subject to a child welfare investigation before they turn age 18. Half of Black children. So this is the norm for Black children, is great awareness of DCFS, because an investigation means you're not only aware of it, you have gone through the trauma of not knowing if you're going to stay at home or be taken away from your home.
That's right.
You know, you may have been strip searched, you may have been taken from your bed and interrogated. And so, what does that mean for Black children that 53% are going to go through that kind of experience? But so, you know, these Black women were telling me, of course, we all know about it. And then I wanted to ask them, and I asked them, what is the impact on your neighborhood? That was the point of my study. What is the impact of living in a neighborhood where everybody is aware of this system? And they all described the system as a kind of invading force in their neighborhood.
Yeah,
You know, they disrupt families, they disrupt children's lives. One thing that came up that I hadn't anticipated was many of them reporting the way in which people used calling the child abuse hotline to resolve conflicts in the neighborhood, retaliation. Uh, One person said, I think people have it on speed dial, the way in which they
geez.
call. Um, but you know, why is that? These are neighborhoods that have been stripped of resources. They've been disinvested in. And so there is this one government agency that's very present in the neighborhood, and they rely on it because everything else is gone. And so, and interesting, probably to me, the most unexpected thing was at the very end, I asked them, is DCFS too involved in your neighborhood, involved too little, or involved just the right amount? And I thought they were going to say too involved, because so many of them said it's harming our children, it's disrupting our lives, it's disrupting our community. We can't get together. Many of them, we can't come together because of this institution. And a majority said it's not involved enough.
Yes, that struck me.
Not enough.
And why though?
Yeah.
Tell
But why?
say why
So
they- yeah.
why? Financial wise,
There we
I'll
go.
never forget.
Economic
It's
support.
financial wise. You know, one said, you might, if you know how to work it, you might actually get some benefits from it. Or, you know, my friend got a crib. So again, it wasn't that they welcomed it because it was actually supporting the neighborhood.
Right. They're looking
It-
for economic support.
They needed economic support. And there was a lot of kinship care going on. So, of course, the relatives, you know, grandma may get a stipend now to help care for her grandchildren.
Mhm.
So, but they were very clear. And in fact, some said, I don't care what help, we don't want it.
Right,
It's not
right.
worth
It's
the
not worth it.
cost. But even those who said it should be more involved, they said, but it shouldn't be involved in that way. There was one mother who was so poignant. She said, on the buses where you see call the child abuse hotline, it doesn't say call if you need some shoes. It doesn't say
Mhm.
call if you need groceries.
That's right.
It doesn't say call if your children need some extra food. It says call if you see abuse, and therefore you're not going to call. She said, why would you call if you know they're going to come in and might take your children?
That's right.
And so they were so astute about what this family policing system could offer and what it couldn't do, and the harm that it causes.
Yeah.
And they were really calling for more resources in their community, but without the threat of family separation.
Absolutely. And that the hotline, the 1-800 abuse hotline, is not 1-800 neglect. And we know,
Yes,
right?
right,
We
right,
know that 70% of the families who are, affected by this
right,
family policing and their children are brought into the
right.
system are brought in because of neglect. So I
Exactly.
want to talk about poverty and neglect.
Yeah.
But I didn't want to skip over mandated
Yeah,
reporting.
so
So
important.
let's get the mandated reporting. Let's go back to
Yeah.
poverty and neglect.
Okay. So mandated reporting is an integral part of this policing system because if you're going to police families, you need police agents to do it.
There you go.
And who are the police agents of this system? They're the mandated reporters. So all states, by federal law, have to set up a system of mandated reporting. They have to identify professionals who are required to report child abuse and neglect to the system. And so every state has some form of mandated reporting. Some more than others. Some have virtually universal. Everybody is a
Everybody.
mandated reporter. Others specify particular professions. This began with just making pediatricians mandated reporters to report abuse of young children and abuse, sexual and physical abuse. It's now spanned to take in teachers and all
Yes.
doctors and
Hmm.
social workers and social service providers and daycare workers
Daycare
and
workers
yes,
and pre-K teachers. And I'm saying
exactly.
this because I'm, trying to be cognizant of our audience, because
Yes,
many of the people in our audience who will be watching this
yes,
are mandated reporters.
exactly,
And they
exactly.
express a real, um, a deep concern, a real
Yes,
sort of being torn, you
yeah,
know,
yes,
between feeling like you want to protect a child. You're not a mandated, I read this someplace, you're not a mandated investigator, though,
right, right,
so
yeah,
you don't have to really,
yeah,
know, you just
right,
have to report. On the other hand, you
yeah.
know what's going to happen when you report.
Well,
So
yeah,
how do we talk to folks
yeah.
that are experiencing that kind of conflict,
Exactly. Well, I think it's unfortunate that there is that conflict. That conflict shows you that this is a bad policy
Yes.
because if you have people whose profession is to care for children and you're turning them into agents of the state in a punitive way that we know deters families. The more and more research is coming out showing this, that it deters families from seeking their help because they're afraid they're going to get reported. And it's not that they're afraid they're going to be reported because they're harming their children.
Right.
They're afraid they're going to be reported because they know so many people who have been reported needlessly, unjustly. And so they know that the system uses family separation as a tool to address problems that families have instead of actually giving them resources. So if they know my family needs housing security, my family needs food, my family needs clothing, my family needs better mental health care or drug treatment, all of these kinds of needs, child care.
Mhm.
And I need these concrete resources to better take care of my children. But I know that if I go to the very people who might help me get those resources, instead of giving me the resources, they're going to turn me over to a system that is not going to give me those resources.
That's right.
The logical thing is not to seek the help. And so we have this perverse system set up where mandated reporting is a barrier to families getting help. It's a barrier to the professionals providing the help. That's why people feel conflicted, because they want, many of them, many of the teachers and social workers and doctors, they want to provide the help to families, but mandated reporting interferes with it.
Yeah.
That's why the idea that ending mandated reporting would be harmful, if you think about it, doesn't make any sense. It is harmful. We know that mandated reporting is harmful. Now, if any of these mandated reporters sees a situation where they feel compelled because there's some immediate danger to children and they have no resources to address it, and they feel compelled, I have to report this, they're free to report it. Nothing
Right.
says you cannot report it.
Right.
All that mandated reporting does is say, well, if you have some vague suspicion, at least this is how some people interpret it, instead of addressing it, I must turn this family over to a system that I know is not really going to address their problems. That's what mandated reporting does. So it doesn't provide the help that families need. And in fact, we know that it interferes with the help that families need.
Yes.
So that's why I feel very comfortable saying we should end mandated reporting. It's not going to endanger children. It's going to allow professionals to provide the resources. And in fact, it would be an incentive to getting those resources in. So, I've talked to so many doctors. I also do a lot of research and advocacy around racism and anti-racism in medicine. So I speak to a lot of doctors. And if I mention this issue, it's the first question that
Isn't it?
I get. What do we do about mandated reporting?
Yeah.
And many of them will say, but I just don't have the resources I need to help these families. All right, then let's have a policy to provide those resources
Yeah.
instead of relying on mandated reporting. They would prefer that. But I think, as I was saying about the ideology behind child welfare,
Mm-hmm.
the system, it's a substitute. It becomes a punitive substitute for what we really should be doing. It's a barrier to the changes that we need to do to really support children and families.
Absolutely. And when you think about, so first you think about the numbers of families whose cases are unsubstantiated, but they experience this investigation
Exactly.
situation, right?
Right.
So
That's right. It's a
there's
good
that
point.
trauma.
Yes.
And so then we end up with
By the way, most investigations.
So then we end up with a subset of those families that are in the system, right?
Yes.
And then we know majority of those are there for poverty and neglect.
Absolutely.
Well, poverty, which is called neglect.
Exactly.
And now we're reading more and more research that says that really the biggest preventive measure you can take in this field is to provide economic supports for families.
Number one.
When you look at
number one. And we know it's so concretely proven. In fact, we have evidence of it just in the past 3 years.
Yes.
Just in the past 3 years, because during the height of the pandemic, the Biden administration and Congress passed policies to provide added income to families. And we know that cut the childhood poverty rate significantly.
That's right.
As soon as that ended, poverty went back up. So I just saw maybe 2 weeks ago a study showing that poverty doubled last year.
Yes,
doubled.
It doubled.
Childhood poverty.
It more than doubled.
Yes.
And when you look at, I just did some research on this. But when you look at what families used that money for,
right.
it was food.
Right.
It was rent.
Yes.
It was utilities.
Yes.
It was basic education. It was childcare.
Right.
It was
Right.
associated educational expenses for their children.
Right.
So
Right.
you have to wonder what kind of a country makes a decision to end that while they're making
Exactly.
the decision to expand mandated reporting.
Exactly.
You just have
That's
to ask that question,
You
don't you?
do. And it's part of what I was saying about the ideology, which is the greater willingness to punish families, regulate families, supervise families, rather than just support them. And there's this underlying belief that many Americans have that if people are impoverished, it's their own fault, and therefore we shouldn't support them. And then having a family policing system that punishes them just reinforces this view, which is a way of deterring us from the kinds of social policies that would actually make children's lives better. That's how this system works. It's a barrier on all these different levels to actually having a nation that supports families and keeps children safe and actually improves children's welfare.
So, what do we do?
Mm-hmm.
So, let's talk a little bit about abolition.
Yeah.
Um,
Yeah.
and yeah, let me just ask you
Mm-hmm.
to talk about
Sure.
abolition. I'd like you to also, since we mentioned what happened during COVID-19,
Yeah.
if you could talk about some examples where, the abolition of the system
Right.
actually happened,
Yeah.
not in a
Yes.
planful way, but just
Right.
because of what was going on with the
Exactly.
pandemic and what the results of that were. So talk a little bit
Exactly.
about abolition, and then I'm going to have a few more questions
Okay.
for you about that. Like
Right.
how do we get there?
Right. Right. So abolition means the end of unjust institutions and the simultaneous creation of the world that we want to see, that's just, that's humane, that's caring, that actually supports human needs, meets human needs, doesn't punish people for human needs. So that's basically what abolition is. And as I said, there's a long history of it right here in the United States with the abolition of slavery, which had a very similar kind of uh, uh, ideology and mission, which was to end the unjust institution of enslaving human beings and simultaneously build a democratic society where all people were treated equally. And of course, we're continuing to fight that battle,
Still.
which is part of the continuation of it in abolishing the family policing system. So, abolishing the family policing system means dismantling it. It's not going to happen overnight. This is a multi-billion-dollar apparatus that is many, many people are invested in ideologically as well as financially. But incrementally dismantling it, but at the very same time, providing the resources that families need that actually meet children's needs, that actually keep children safe. So that's what abolition means. Now, why should we do this? Well, for all the reasons we've been discussing. The system we have now is harmful to children and families. It's so well documented that it's harmful.
Yes.
There are mountains of research showing the harms to children of being placed in substitute care. So much, not just that came out during the Trump administration's policy at the border, but we've known this for decades, and the research continues to showing it. We also know, as we just discussed, that providing income to families is a far better way than punishing them, taking their children away, to improve the welfare of children. So we know better policies and practices, and we know the harms that the current system inflicts. So all abolition of the family policing system or child welfare system means is to end the harms and figure out a better way, which again, we see the path. I mean, it takes work, but we see the path toward that of actually supporting families, keeping children safe, improving children's welfare. That's what abolition is. And it's, you said earlier, some people find it scary. I
Yes.
think people find it scary because either because they haven't analyze, they may not be aware of how the system actually functions and the harms that it causes. And also, they have no idea of something better. Like they can't imagine something better because they haven't seen something better for children.
Yes.
But Mhm.
And also because some of my best friends are child welfare people,
Yeah,
have been in
yeah,
child welfare a long time.
yeah,
And these are folks who deeply care about children,
yeah,
who have
yeah,
committed their
yes,
lives,
right, yeah,
to the welfare of children.
yeah,
But I think part of what happens, just to your immediate point there, is that it's hard to see the possibility, of doing what actually works to
yeah.
support children and families when you see the money going somewhere else.
Yes, exactly. Right, right.
So part of this is around how do we change the way that the funding flows,
Yes, right,
So,
right.
okay, right? So,
Yes, but that's part of the answer.
yes.
So one thing about the child welfare system, often when you say we need this radical change, people say, "Well, where's the money going to come from?" Okay, I have the richest nation in the world, so the money is there. It's what it's being spent on. But also, if we just look at the child welfare system, it does spend billions, between 30 and 40 billion dollars. These are the official statistics. It's probably more than that on this system, most of it going to family separation and maintaining children outside of their home. So the money is actually there in the system. It's not like we have to find it somewhere else. Now, I would say that's not even enough to actually provide the resources, concrete material resources that families need. I would want more, but we could start with taking that money and putting it into communities. I firmly believe that if we took $30 billion and distributed it to the most impoverished families, we would cut child neglect dramatically. If we put that into housing, we would cut child neglect dramatically. So that would be a better use of the money. I'm not saying that's all we should do, but that's
Mhm.
just an example of what could be done. But, we have to change minds. This requires a
A
movement which is
movement.
growing to make people aware of the harms of the system and to get people to understand that abolition doesn't mean abandoning children to harmful parents. It's the
Yes.
opposite. It's interesting when you said that most investigations end in unsubstantiated
Mhm.
reports. Now, that shows that there are many, many families who are being accused that should not have been accused, that are
Correct.
being subjected to investigations. But it also shows that for most of the families that may need support, there's absolutely nothing that the system does for them. Because, it could be that there
Yeah,
is some need that the family has, but it's unsubstantiated because it doesn't rise to a certain risk, or
that's right.
there's nothing, the caseworker feels there's nothing I can really do for this family, but maybe the family does have a need. But the system doesn't address it. It doesn't address the vast majority of needs that children actually have. And
Right.
so what abolition would do is actually provide more for families. It would reduce the harms to children. And this is not about abandoning children at all. It's actually about ending the trauma that children experience through family separation and
Mhm.
providing better for children in this nation.
So, do we have some examples? Do you have some examples of what's working in that
Mhm.
regard that we
Mhm.
could look to? When we build the
Mhm.
body of work at
Yeah.
Build, to be redundant.
Yeah.
Uh,
It's a
um,
good name.
when we build this body of work,
Yeah.
one of the things we want to do is highlight what works
Yeah.
and to be able to share among
Yeah.
other states and other jurisdictions,
Yeah.
what's working so they can
Right.
pick it up and replicate.
Right. Right. Right.
So, what do we
Yes.
have that works?
Okay. So I want to pick up on what you suggested about what we know from the COVID lockdown period.
Yes, yes.
Because that's very, very telling. So during the COVID lockdown in many cities, but I'm most familiar with New York City, Basically, the family policing system shut down. Caseworkers investigated far less cases, only the most extreme. Judges were not ordering separations of families to the far less than they typically do. And there was this alarm that because more families weren't being investigated and children were at home, there was going to be this steep rise in child abuse. It turns out that no, that did not happen at all. In fact, even the head of the Administration for Children's Services in New York admitted there was no increase in child abuse. And some people said it was actually a decrease. But let's just stick with no increase.
Yeah.
It did not increase at all. And what is the reason why? There's a professor at NYU, Anna Ahrens, who wrote a piece suggesting, I think actually very compellingly, showing that the reason was those income supports for families that happened at the same time. But also importantly, in New York City, there's a network of mutual aid organizations. These are grassroots organizations that provide free, concrete resources to families, groceries, diapers, even some mental health care, child care, these kinds of things. And they came out just in force, providing resources for communities, more than $100,000 of at least of resources distributed in impoverished neighborhoods in New York City. And so those two things combined, which give us some idea of what can work, both income supports from the government, but also grassroots community-based organizations, mutual aid organizations. That is what works to reduce the need, the perceived need of child investigations and family separation. And that is much better for families. So how can we support families? So that's a concrete example. And those mutual aid networks, grassroots organizations that provide for families, that's what we need to invest money in. That's what we need to support. That's what we need to promote as where people can go for help. And those mandated reporters, also can send families for help if they can't provide it themselves. Another example is family defenders. These are units in legal services offices that represent families that are at risk of being separated or where there's been an investigation to avoid family separation or to return children quickly to their homes. And many cities have this. I'm most familiar with New York City and Philadelphia, where I live. There's community legal services in Philadelphia. There are legal services, family defenders units in the Bronx, in Harlem, and in Brooklyn. And they are multidisciplinary centers or units where you have the lawyers who represent the families in court, but you also have social workers and you have peer advocates, parents who have been impacted by the system, who provide support, insight, advice to families. And these units work incredibly well in keeping families together. That's a unit like that has also been implemented in many hospitals around the country in legal medical units, partnerships, medical legal partnerships.
It brings to mind also the early childhood court teams, because this is the same. People don't realize that when they go into the system, how much of a legal system they're in. They think they're in a social work system, but they're in a legal system.
This is all court-based, court-ordered, court-based, court-supervised.
Absolutely. So those sound like, those are great examples. I hope that our audience who's listening has heard some things that make them feel like there is something that we can do, because I always want to issue a call to action, to our audience. And I want to thank you from the bottom of my heart for the work that you've done, for opening our eyes, for teaching us so much. and just having this conversation
Oh,
with me
thank you
today.
so much. It
Thank
was an
you.
honor and a pleasure.